Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Esther Nani. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a faculty member and the director of the School of Disability Studies. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to the second in a six-part Sex in the Pandemic speaker series. I'm going to begin today with a land acknowledgement, but I am also going to begin with a bit of a caveat. As some of you may know, I live with visual impairment and I do have written notes. So I ask you to bear with me as I proceed with crip pacing. So as we gather here today to learn from one another, to listen, and to participate in critical discussion, we acknowledge that we and the School of Disability Studies is on Treaty 13 territory. Treaty 13 is a treaty that was established between the Mississauga of the Credit River and the British Crown. We are surrounded by the territories of Treaty 13A, Treaty 20, also known as the Williams Treaty, and Treaty 19. I speak to you today from the city that is currently known as Toronto, and from the university whose name is in some contention. We're located in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe. And it is joined by allied nations to peacefully share and protect the resources around the Great Lakes. The purpose of land acknowledgements is for us to pause and consider our own relations to one another and to the land. And I encourage all of us to think about where we are as we participate in this session today, and to acknowledge the places in which we live. For those of us who, like myself, are settlers, who are non-Indigenous settlers to this land, especially for people who've been brought here through force, especially those who've been brought forcibly through the transatlantic slave trade, we acknowledge that we are members in this treaty, that we are all treaty people, and that we are grateful to be on this land where we work, live, and love. Now, I want to welcome, I believe, our two speakers today and the audience for taking part in this compelling series. If you were not at the first one, I believe that Ricky will provide us with more information on how you may be able to see where the conversation started. And I encourage you to continue attending the series to discover where the conversations will take us in the subsequent months. The work that we're going to see today comes out of a successful social science and humanities connection grant that came out of the research that Dr. Ricky Varghese has conducted. And it allows us to think about sex, sexuality, and intimacy in the context of our evolving understanding of pandemics. Dr. Varghese is currently starting his second year of a 2-year postdoc, the Tanis Stowe Postdoctoral Fellowship in Disability Studies, Gender, and Social Justice with the School of Disability Studies. We've been very fortunate to have him with us and to be stretching our thinking in many provocative ways. The School of Disability Studies, for those of you who are new to the school, offers a part-time undergraduate degree completion program and has a robust record of postgraduate support and study. So we're at both ends of the post-secondary education trajectory. Our work is very much focused around equity and justice. We're interested in taking up disability, madness, and deafhood as affirmative and desirable disruptions that allow us to reimagine how we might think about intimacy, sexuality, health, risk, grief, memory, pandemics, all the themes that are being addressed in the Sex and the Pandemic series. So Ricky's work is so very instrumental in the larger project of critical disability, MAD, and deaf studies in which the school is so deeply engaged. So I want to welcome you, the speakers, and the audience to the fascinating conversations that I'm sure will take place over the next couple of hours. Judging from the pre-conversation, I think we should be prepared to be a bit entertained as well. So I turn things over to Ricky. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that very lovely note of welcome and for providing the land announcement and for being here for the second panel of the speaker series. Hi, everyone. I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the second panel of the Sex and the Pandemic series this afternoon. It's great to be here with you, and I'm super excited to be running this series for you. As Esther mentioned, my name is Ricky Ruiz, and I'm an Annisville postdoctoral fellow in gender, disability, and social justice here at the School of Disability Studies, which is housed in the Faculty of Community Services. My own research lies at the intersection of psychoanalysis, sexology, suicidology, death studies, and critical historiography. I'm particularly interested in tracing and tracking the shifts and changes that have taken place in the history of sex and sexuality. My contention is that with every confusion, the history of sex gets reimagined, reconstituted, and rewritten. I believe this was the case with the HIV/AIDS, and I sense that COVID-19 as well. I sense that COVID-19 will have its impact on how we consider intimacy and the landscape of the sexual. While HIV/AIDS is used as a historical template regarding the interplay between sexual life and viruses, I want to make clear that this speaker series is not about underscoring a straightforward comparison between HIV/AIDS and the current contagion. Rather, I imagine this series as a way to explore what it means to live alongside viruses, as we have always done so, from generation to generation and from epoch to epoch. As vaccines become available and accessible to some, a version of an end to this pandemic seems to appear in the horizon. However, taking on a global sensibility, they will quickly realize that the pandemic was far from over, and they will have to find new, creative, and innovative ways of being with one another. In fact, my hope is that this series outlines a blueprint of sorts of what living with the perpetual presence of the virus looks like for some of us. What what might it mean to reorganize desire as such in these times, especially in these highly mediated days? How is desire policed? What does it mean to be nostalgic for a bygone era? What does it mean in community in this historical moment? How are these terms constituted socio-politically, historically, and economically? The initial calls for the end is the idea that they're supposed to be all in this together felt like a fantasy structure unto itself. Over time, many of us quickly realized that the we in this together is anything but a universal we. My hope is that the talks today unsettle this push toward universalizing the experience of COVID-19 in a critical direction. It is with these thoughts in mind that I welcome you all to the series and the second panel in the series. I hope that you will find the ensuing conversation provocative, insightful, and pushes us in a critical and rigorous manner. A bit about how this afternoon will proceed. After both the speakers have given their thoughts, I will initiate the discussion between the four of us to get us started. After that, we'll open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Alex Chernowski will refute and present them to the panelists. Allie will now give a few words about how you can ask questions and provide your comments during the discussion portion of the afternoon.
Thanks, Ricky. So hi, everyone. I'm the RA for the Sex and the Pandemic series. And I'm just going to go over a few access notes. And as Ricky mentioned, I will be on screen later to read out questions from the chat. Just to note that we do have live captioning today. So if you would like to see the live captioning, please click the CC button on your Zoom menu bar, which is usually at the bottom. So there will be a few ways for you to participate in today's panel. First, feel free to use the chat box to ask questions directly to panelists and to chat with your fellow attendees. Please note that the chat box is automatically set to send messages only to panelists. If you would like everyone to see your remarks, please click the arrow next to the button and click all panelists and attendees before you send your text. If in the Q&A portion of the panel, you would like to actually speak out loud, you can press the raise hand button and we will then enable your microphone at the appropriate time. Also, Zoom webinars have a question and answer feature. To use this feature, press the question and answer button, type your question into the Q&A box and click send. You can also choose to send this question anonymously by checking the box below the typing area that says anonymous. We can reply to these questions live or in text in this window. As an attendee, you can also like other attendees' questions. If you'd like to see it answered as well, just click the thumbs up icon to like a question or comment in this window. Okay, that's it.
Thanks for that, Allie. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker. Initially, our first speaker was supposed to be Alexander McClelland. Unfortunately, he was unable to make it due to a conflict in his schedule that came up at the very last minute. And he sends his regrets to everyone. He wishes that he was here. So let's start with Matthew Rodriguez, who will be our first speaker. Matthew is an award-winning queer Latinx essayist, journalist, and editor. He is currently senior editor at Culture Desk at Atlantic, Prior to that appointment, he served as the associate editor at The Body, the internet's premier HIV/AIDS news site. His work encompasses the HIV epidemic, queer issues, and popular culture. For his work, he has been awarded Web Health Awards, Food Media Awards, a New York Society of Professional Journalists Deadline Award, and an NLGA Award. His writing has been featured in Slate, E-Law, Out, Net, and The Village Voice. He was one of the founding staff writers at NU, the LGBTQ plus magazine launched by Liner. So, Matthew.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. And I'm so excited to be able to get to chat with all of you. I'm going to be sharing slides and talking while the slides are up. So let me get to sharing, right? They're very pretty. I really wanted to make them pretty for you all. So I'm going to be talking about AIDS nostalgia and how it gets in the way of fighting COVID or responding to COVID. I actually don't like that I use the word fighting COVID. I don't love fighting metaphors. I don't know why I did that, but let's just say responding to a collective response to COVID. And my idea for this talk actually started with a piece I wrote last year for The Body. And I noticed early on in the COVID pandemic that there was quite a bit of discussion. There was almost a tension, right, in how we responded to COVID, and that there were some people who really wanted to look towards the AIDS epidemic for lessons on how to respond to the COVID pandemic, while there were also people who felt like they were dissimilar, and also that the the AIDS epidemic affected a particular group of people and that it was not the same with COVID. And I saw a lot of chatter both ways. And for me, the chatter really came to a head when ACT UP New York decided to post these two images. And I'm going to read them both for you. So one is a play on, or an update or a remix of the famous David Wojnarowicz jacket that said, "If I die of AIDS, forget burial, just drop my body on the steps of the FDA." And the update was a COVID mask that said, "If I die of COVID-19, forget burial, drop my body on the steps of Mar-a-Lago." Mar-a-Lago, of course, being the resort that former President Trump, US President Trump owns. And the second, which actually came later, like a few weeks later or a few days later, was an orange triangle that says Trump equals, with the words "Trump equals death" underneath, meant to contrast with the famous Grand Fury image of silence equals death with the pink triangle. So these happened very early on. You can see the timestamp. I don't know if you can see where my mouse is, but I'm not sure. But the first image came out March 23rd. So I hate saying early because I don't think that the bounds of the pandemic are the dates that we think they are. But in terms of when the United States was responding to the COVID pandemic, it was very early in that response. So the response to it was very, oh, and there is some language in some of these tweets, so I will issue a language warning. So some people, were really against this. So the time to equate these two things was never, absolutely not, can you effing not, guys, what the F, the people dying are the people who didn't give an F, blah, blah, blah. So there was a lot of response to the ACT UP tweets that felt that they were disrespectful, that felt that they were equating two things that shouldn't be equated. And this response really, I want to say, activated me, because I felt like, the thing that was getting in the way of us learning from the epidemic was this idea of AIDS nostalgia. And I want to go into, and I don't think that there's one single definition of AIDS nostalgia. I don't even think the definition I'm going to give you is great, but I think that we can all start thinking about what AIDS nostalgia is and how it operates. So what is AIDS? I mean, that's a loaded question, right? AIDS can be, sorry, was someone saying something? Okay. What is AIDS? It's a loaded question. AIDS is a diagnosis. So if HIV is a virus, AIDS is a diagnosis, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and it's a diagnosis that someone living with HIV receives when the number of T cells they get goes below a certain threshold. The threshold has changed over time, and the threshold is different in different countries, but it's usually around like 200 T cells. But you know, it could mean a lot of different things. I've heard, you know, a friend of mine who I worked with when I worked at the Body always used to say that AIDS felt a little bit more of a political term than HIV. Like HIV was clinical, but AIDS was political. Everything's political, but AIDS, specifically saying AIDS, was also very political. AIDS I feel like sometimes it's also an emphatic, like, you know, you don't have, like, you know, in Spanish specifically too, I'm Puerto Rican, you know, there's such an urgency when we say SIDA as for AIDS, like it feels sometimes more urgent or more, you know, culturally, there's this feel that it's an emphatic way of talking about the epidemic. And then of course, AIDS is an epidemic. So a diagnosis for me is often on an individual level. And if you look at a larger level, there's the epidemic when many people are being diagnosed with an AIDS diagnosis. And then I put question marks because I would love to hear, I don't know if maybe if you want to put in the chat what AIDS means to you. I don't want to offer you only my definitions of AIDS. These actually aren't even definitions. These are things that I felt could illuminate our talk about AIDS today. I would love for you in the chat to add what you feel AIDS is, and then also read the chat and see like what other people are saying and what that term means to you and how you separate AIDS from HIV. Oh, yeah, okay. So what is nostalgia? For me, nostalgia is just a fetishization of the past. Like, you know, something about the past is better than it was now. There's something in the past that I want. There's something in the past that is better than we have now. So that's just a word. That was just a quick, but I also want you to reflect in the chat if you can on what you think nostalgia is. So this is something that I came up with. This does not have to be what you think it is, or it's not the final word. This isn't published anywhere except this slide deck that I got on some free website. So I just said that AIDS nostalgia is an idea of AIDS that situates the AIDS epidemics squarely in the past. It's espoused by people who see the epidemic largely as over or of a different era. They associate AIDS with the 80s, Reaganism, ACT UP, and more, and don't see the AIDS era of the 1980s as intersecting with our time or ongoing. So like I said, that's just a working definition for what I'm going to be talking about today. You do not need to take that as gospel. I'm sure some of you have already have ways to complicate it, and I would love to see those complications in the chat. So really quickly, I just want to talk about how media reinforces AIDS nostalgia. So what are the types of stories that get told about AIDS? For instance, for How to Survive a Plague, which is a documentary by David France from, I believe, 2012 or 2013, I think 2012. You know, when media talks about AIDS, it's often in the past. There are very few contemporary stories around AIDS. There are, and they're great. If anyone's seen the web series Paz Raz, that's great. I'm not saying like, wow, that's great. I'm saying like, watch Paz Raz. But there are very few, most media narratives, especially ones that are celebrated and ones that are amplified and given awards, situate AIDS in the past, like How to Survive a Plague, like Dallas Buyers Club, like Rent, the movie, and like Bohemian Rhapsody. And these movies feature individual actors. So in How to Survive a Plague, it's really a story about 5 men from ACT UP when ACT UP was a broad, diverse coalition of hundreds of people. How to Survive a Plague is a story of 5 white men and like one or so women who responded to AIDS. Dallas Buyers Club is about one straight man and one trans woman played by a cisgender man. Rent is about a group of friends, but ultimately about them as separate from their community. Like it's about this group of friends kind of almost like divorced from everything going around them. And then Bohemian Rhapsody is about one celebrity, living with HIV. Often white protagonists, so reinforcing the idea that AIDS is linked to white queerness. Often white saviors are often featured, queer antagonism, and an emphasis on the past. So these are just some things that I think are kind of like threads that happen in a lot of different media that feature AIDS narratives. I'm not saying that all of these movies feature all of these things. In fact, a lot of these movies just feature one of these things. But I mean, Dallas Buyers Club, that's a white savior and is kind of also queer antagonistic. Bohemian Rhapsody, very queer antagonistic. If anyone has seen it, they actually manipulated the timeline of things to kind of punish. I wrote about this, it's on the internet, you can find it, but it's like, they actually, Freddie Mercury has passed and the bandmates made the film and they actually toyed with the timeline of when Freddie Mercury came out to make it seem as if like they had to forgive him for abandoning them and then getting HIV and stuff like that. So it was a really like post-death manipulation of someone's life. So when I say AIDS nostalgia, it actually, these are some harmful narratives, but it's this idea that AIDS is a thing that happened in the past. And when it happened, queer people got together and there was, community and, we sang and like, this is what it was like to be queer. And the nostalgia part is also linked to like, for a lot of queer people in identity formation, like, an emphasis on how the queer community really got together and responded, and the response happened in the past and is not ongoing, is not still happening. Queer people are still responding to AIDS. Queer people are still dying from AIDS. Queer people are still living with HIV. Queer people are still responding to HIV. So a lot of these films actually idealize the response to AIDS and make it feel like, this was in the 80s, pre mainstreaming of queer identity, and they're actually ahistorical in that way. Oh, my thing won't let me click. Okay. So how does AIDS nostalgia hurt us in the fight against COVID? And actually, I don't know if I can get a time check, if someone can just tell me how much of my time I have left. Is that a possibility?
You're fine. You have another 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So how does AIDS nostalgia hurt us in the fight against COVID? So we've talked a little bit about what AIDS nostalgia is, and I want to talk. So narratives that invoke AIDS nostalgia treat the AIDS epidemic as a cabinet curio or family heirloom. Now, what does that mean? So this is an idea that I keep coming back to, in that some people treat the AIDS epidemic as precious, as something that you can't touch, and that kind of happened with those images that we saw earlier that ACT UP New York tweeted, and a lot of people felt that remixing them was an affront to David Wojnarowicz or was an affront to Grand Fury. And it was because those images are seen or thought of as responding to an epidemic that happened, as opposed to one that is ongoing. And really, for me, those images were, whether you like them or not, whether you think they're artful or not, those images were part of an ongoing response to the AIDS epidemic, and really were commenting on how the COVID pandemic amplified, complicated, problematized, a lot of different verbs, and interacted with how the AIDS and COVID pandemics interacted, complicated each other, problematized each other, worked with each other, worked against each other. I mean, there's so many ways they intersect. So when we treat the AIDS epidemic as something that we can't touch, as something that happened, as opposed to something that was ongoing, we don't actually absorb the lessons from it. And so I want to talk about the lessons that we can learn and how we can reframe them. So we know that AIDS and COVID in countries around the world, cities around the world, places around the world affect people that are most marginalized. And I'm coming from an American perspective, and I'll own that and say that in America and in a lot of the West, there's an idea that, health is a personal health is an individual responsibility, that, you know, I'm living with type 2 diabetes, right? And I'm coming from the background that my father was HIV positive and he was a drug user. So there are people who would say, well, you use drugs and therefore, you know, of course you got HIV, as opposed to why didn't the government respond to the AIDS epidemic by starting syringe exchange programs or safe injection sites? And for instance, with type 2 diabetes, you know, a lot of people believe that type 2 diabetes is a result of constant eating or just not disciplining yourself. And that's a really common idea in America, that when you are sick, it is your fault. That's why we have the terrible, that's why we have the health insurance, you know, that we do. That's why we have the system that is in place, because we think of it as an individual problem, as opposed to failure of systems, which health actually is. A failure of the social contract for the state to take care of its people. And so I add this quote, "The color of AIDS in America is black," by Adam Geary, from his book, Anti-Black Racism and the AIDS Epidemic. I think that's what it's called. Don't quote me on that, but that's who wrote it. But that's the opening line of their book. And I just love that because it also fights against the idea that AIDS only happened to white people in movies. Personal responsibility, this is what we talked about. There's an American Western conception of health as individual. AIDS narratives that focus on individuals reify that. COVID narratives around personal responsibility thrive on an ahistorical view of AIDS, meaning, you know, when we talk about COVID and we talk about COVID solely through like, are you wearing your mask? Are you doing this? Are you, like, the personal responsibility of you getting vaccinated, blah, blah, like those narratives are actually left over. I mean, there are so many ways in which personal responsibility narratives come out of many health epidemics that happen in the US, not just AIDS. But I do think, given how close in the timeline of the world AIDS and COVID are, I think a lot of that is left over from our ideas of personal responsibility. And I think that some of the same conversations that we have around COVID, whether it be masks or vaccines, can be reframed outside of personal responsibility into collective response, communal responsibility, taking care of each other, you know. But when we talk about them as personal level responsibility, that's actually coming to us through an ahistorical view of the HIV epidemic and AIDS. Woo! See, sometimes the clicker is just not working. COVID criminalization. So if for those who I imagine a lot of people here have heard of HIV criminalization, maybe not everyone has, but in the United States and in many countries around the world, you know, people living with HIV, their bodies are monitored by the state, their bodies are criminalized by the state, and that can manifest itself in several different ways. It can manifest itself through laws that criminalize non-disclosure of HIV status. It can manifest itself through enhanced sentences. I hate the word, actually. Let's say additional, like, you know, additional time added to sentences for people living with HIV when they commit a crime, or if they are accused of a crime, or if they are if they are found guilty of a crime. So COVID itself has already been criminalized many ways during the pandemic. You know, we've seen everything from people, especially poor Black people in certain areas, being arrested or having an interaction with the police because they're not wearing their mask. Of course, it's disproportionately Black and brown people who get policed for being in public without their mask, as opposed to like white people who do it. And the way we police and criminalize it. So, I mean, the HIV epidemic, a lot of the HIV criminalization laws, what people don't realize is that a lot of them kind of came along in the United States, especially with HIV funding. So when states would pass like HIV funding, they would also add in like, okay, if we're going to do funding for this, we have to criminalize it. And even though our understanding of the virus has progressed so much, and we know that, you know, it's actually very difficult to transmit HIV, and it's essentially impossible to transmit HIV if you are undetectable. These laws don't factor in science, and they also are just inhumane and cruel, and responding to public health with policing and criminalization is not a way to fight an epidemic, and that is happening again with COVID. So I want to talk really quickly, and I want to make sure I get the authors, the artists' names correct. I have them written down really quickly. So this is a piece of art that I think really encapsulates what I'm talking about, and the artists are Ian Bradley Perrin and Vincent Chevalier, and they did this for Toronto's AIDS Action Now, and I believe it was 2014, right? Or 2012, 2013. And I'm going to read a quote from them just talking about this piece, which is called "Your Nostalgia is Killing Me." And it is about HIV criminalization and how when we think about AIDS only in the past and not as something that is still ongoing, how we disremember, disrespect, invisibilize the people with HIV who are still being punished by the state simply for living with a virus that they have because of a lack of state response. In an interview, Bradley Perrin said that the poster is a reaction to nostalgia around AIDS, and the quote, role nostalgia has played in overwriting the realities of the period with visual cues of comfort and community. He added, when we think about the 80s and the 90s and we talk about the Ashes Action, the Act of Ashes Action, and the public funerals, and we uproot them from their historical specificity, when we say things are different for us now, we are not thinking about the ways in which criminalizing is exacting a death on past people today. So the nostalgia of comfort and community versus the reality of there is an ongoing response to the AIDS crisis. And it has intersected with now the ongoing response to the COVID crisis. I believe that that's my last slide, and I just kept this slide because it was pretty and I wanted to end on something pretty. So thank you. If you have any questions, this is my email. I'm also on Twitter. Don't hate tweet me. Please just be nice and DM me, or if you disagree with me, DM me, or we can have a conversation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. We'll have a period at the very end after we have our next speaker speak. But I'm actually really interested in maybe talking more about this question of personal responsibility. I'm hoping we can pick that up after the next speaker. Our next and final speaker for today is Ed for short, Hal. Ed is a Canadian-born, Brooklyn-based writer, organizer, and educator. He is an adjunct professor at the New School and founding member of the What Would an HIV Doula Do collective. He was the guest editor of What You Don't Know About AIDS, could fill a museum for on curating. His writing has appeared in the Village Voice, The Advocate, The Body, Pause, CBC, C Magazine, and elsewhere, including academic publications such as WSQ, QEE, and RAID. In 2017, he was an interviewer for Visual Arts at the AIDS Epidemic and Oral History Project for the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institute. The Alexandra Youth House, he is the co-author of We Are Having This Conversation Now, The Times of AIDS Cultural Production, forthcoming from youth, and is the guest curator of a people's history of the pandemic, AIDS posters and stories of public health, National Library of Medicine 2021. So that your stage.
Oh, Ted, you're muted still, just so you know.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Matthew, for that amazing presentation. You gave us a lot to think about. And of course, thank you, Cindy and Emma and Tali, for everything that you're doing today to make it possible. I am a white, cis, HIV negative gay dude who lives in New York, but is currently in Edmonton, Alberta, which I understand is on stolen land, the land belonging to the Cree, the Blackfoot, Dene, Nakota, Sioux, and other communities and other nations. And so I'm aware of that, and I just wanted to add to the land acknowledgement. And I'm just gonna start. I have a slideshow. Let's get that going. And then I'm going to present, and here we go. So as I mentioned, I'm in Edmonton, and I'm going to be reading my notes because I wanted to make sure I stayed on time. So let me just start by saying my Edmonton ghosts come on hard as soon as I arrive. Not only the ghosts of my mother and my father and my grandparents, but also my second boyfriend, an arts editor who was kind to me, a writer I used to know, and a business magnate whose death upset many of my friends. I used to try to keep the ghosts at bay, but now I welcome them. I greet them even as a ritual when I walk through Edmonton's River Valley. Earlier this week, I was doing just that when I saw a dog ahead on the path, looking almost embarrassed. As I got closer, I could see the dog was guarding a pair of legs, standing in the bushes. And soon enough, I could see another pair of legs, kind of entangled yet crouched with the standing pair of legs. It took me a second, but I finally understood that poor pup was the lookout for a River Valley rendezvous. I kept my head down as I walked past, smiling at the erotic pair and as they did their business, and I continued my commune with my ghosts. I was not sure what I wanted to share with you today, but I thought this story of carnal connection and ever-present death was an important offering for the Sex and the Pandemic series. So that's my prologue. Part 1. The first sex I had in this pandemic was sweaty, quick, and nearly silent. It was with a friend in a spare room while another friend was watching Tiger King down the hall. The work of keeping quiet as we undressed added to our connection, partners in wordless urgency. We took turns squeezing each other, cracking each other's spines, and we flipped furiously, yearning to feel flooded, buried, and useful. Even after we were a mess of cum and sweat, we kissed hard. As hungry as we were for release, what we craved was to be steadied. It was not the first time we had fucked. In fact, I had the good fortune of being in a pod with someone who I'd been sleeping with for the last 8 years, although irregularly. Moments of fun between us and others after a night out, or planned meetups when we missed each other. But our spring 2020 sex was different. We'd both adapted quickly to COVID-19 and tried to help others do the same. The creation of our pod had been a lifeline to whatever might count as normal amid all the panic and planning. We needed to close our eyes, stop thinking, and remember what it was to let someone breathe on us, to let someone breathe heavy in our ear. So when on a sleepy afternoon, our fingers interlaced and out of view of our friend dozing off to Carol Baskin on the screen, we understood this was our chance. We could return to our bodies and disappear. Part 2. What Would an HIV Doula Do began in 2015 as a group of people impacted by and living with HIV. We would meet every few weeks to consider the question of our name. Together, inspired by doulas for birth, abortion, gender, and end-of-life care, we came to define a doula as someone who holds space during times of transition, with the understanding that HIV is a series of transitions that begin long before a test and continue after death. In the first few years, we would invite guests over Skype or in person to share their HIV-related points of view with us, including Zoe Dodd and Alexander McClelland, who talked to us about HIV and anarchy, and also Jessica Danforth, who helped us understand that as much as we may doula individuals and we may doula each other, we also doula the systems we live under. In these meetings, when we didn't have guests, we would sit in a circle eating snacks we brought for each other, discussing how HIV impacted how we had sex, who we voted for, the art we liked, and the jobs we had. We would also talk about our unresolved relationships to capitalism, transphobia, homophobia, racism, xenophobia, ableism, and all these other things that kept us stuck in our fear around HIV. We knew that as powerful as HIV is, the real problem is everything that exasperates transmission. At some point, even among these amazing conversations, a kind of urgency disappeared from our gatherings. So I switched us to a project-based collective where we came together around the interests, skills, and experiences of collective members living with and deeply impacted by HIV, and opportunities to collaborate with others to eradicate the harm of HIV. This included taking up space at whitewashed exhibitions about AIDS, where we drew in audiences to appreciate the art around us, while also trying to create some conversation about who and what was missing from the narrative. This also included working with places like the Queen's Museum to create a free bilingual publication that illustrates how the crisis is intersectional and ongoing. And our work together also included producing free writing workshops taught by writers living with HIV. The first 2 years of our founding of What Would an HIV Doula Do coincided with an uptick in culture about AIDS being produced. Some of this culture being produced was amazing, and some of it, if I'm honest, is not so good. It seems that a lot of the culture that seems to be about HIV is rooted less in the virus and more misplaced anxiety about intimacy and history. So instead of just calling out the culture we didn't like, we partnered with other groups to have meaningful conversations or to produce work we did like. So for example, we partnered with the arts group Triple Canopy to host a town hall-like event where impacted folks could talk about what they needed, wanted, liked, and disliked about AIDS-related culture. And from there, we produced a PDF called 21 Questions to Consider When Embarking Upon AIDS-Related Cultural Production. Among the questions posed in this PDF was the following. As cultural producers working on HIV/AIDS, how do we engage with the fact that we are participating in the creation of history? Soon enough, we ourselves would have a chance to answer this question. The One Archives Foundation contacted scholar and What Would an HIV Doula member, Alex, to curate an exhibition about AIDS for the LGBT Center in New York City. As a white, HIV-negative cis woman, she felt that she was not in the position to curate the exhibition alone. So she suggested instead that What Would an HIV Doula Do curate the exhibition? The One Archive Foundation agreed. And over the next few years, members Juanza, Alex, me, and Kat curated an exhibition called Metanoia, Transformation Through AIDS Archives and Activism. This exhibition centered the lives of Black women living with HIV and their activist contributions. This exhibition, like our other projects, was an opportunity for us to learn and share, and maybe most importantly, hold space for people as they consider their relationship to HIV and what they thought they knew about the history of the epidemic and the ongoing response. Part 3. Weeks after me and my podmate had our first pandemic sex encounter, I invited him into my room, even though no one else was home. I closed the door, turned around, and found him sitting on the bed, looking lost. I sat beside him. Our knees touched. I watched as his face registered a half grin before fading back into uncertainty. I took his hand. The cocoon-like feel of my room eased us into conversation. We whispered, even though we didn't have to. We started sharing our experiences since we'd seen each other last. I told him about the essay I'd written for the CBC about all the George Floyd protests I'd been to that started the week the city went under curfew. He talked about how the last time he was at Reese Beach, a nearby queer getaway, talk of protests and inequality crashed through the flirting. Soon, our voices steadier, we began talking about how one of our common friends had tested positive for COVID, how his boyfriend was no longer able to see him, and how our friend's roommate was having to take care of him instead. This pandemic, I joked, is turning us into the Golden Girls faster than we planned. As we talked, I cupped his crotch through his pants, more for a sense of grounding than desire. Eventually, we leaned in and kissed. At one point, I began to pull away. He clenched his thighs, trapping my hand. I used my other hand to push him on his back. We kissed more until he kicked off his shoes and we fell asleep. This was a very restorative nap. I think it was one of the most relaxing naps in the history of all pandemics. Part 4. Before New York City went into lockdown, artists Ripley, Virgil, and I created a graphic, an event, and a mantra for what would an HIV doula do. Let's not be afraid of each other. The graphic was the words repeated over images from the Todd Haynes movie Safe. The event and the mantra were born out of our awareness that in the face of a public health crisis, individuals will look for people to blame and will become fearful of each other in the name of survival. We also knew that the fear of each other would only exacerbate the harm of the crisis for people already marginalized by biased systems, and it would provide a cover for privileged people and their bad behavior. We knew that bringing people together was a good idea, so, unable to meet in person, for the first time in the history of the collective, we planned an online event. Over 50 people came to Let's Not Be Afraid of Each Other to share their questions, experiences, and concerns. After that first event, we hosted 2 more similar events. And importantly, we as a collective began hosting regular meetings again, but of course, virtually, which meant members from outside of New York could participate. These virtual gatherings were many things, including an opportunity to share the triggering, frustrating, and scary aspects of COVID. The online meetings were a place for many of us, often in caretaking roles, where we could break down, express fear, talk about having COVID, vent about the people we were living with, and sometimes even laugh at the absurdity of living among protests, pandemics, and political instability. It was in this witnessing of each other that another project was born. Early in the pandemic, I saw how member Tamara had been keeping a visual diary of her daily walks during lockdown, brief moments when she allowed herself on the empty streets of New York to breathe, to get supplies, and to talk about the pandemic with unhoused people in the area. I've known Tamara for a long time. She is a legendary harm reductionist. Seeing her photos online so early in COVID made me wonder if people already responding to HIV might have an easier time adapting to the new pandemic. I emailed the doulas and other people I thought might be interested and asked them to submit short texts and images in response to the prompt, what does a COVID-19 doula do? Soon we had over 20 entries and we worked with the One Archives Foundation to make a zine. More publications followed. We built off the success of the 21 questions model and put out a PDF called 27 Questions for Writers and Journalists to Consider when Writing about COVID-19 and HIV/AIDS. After a Zoom gathering inspired by fellow member Matthew's article about casual sex, we put out a zine co-edited by me and Diana called In Our Bodies, a zine about pleasure, intimacy, and reality in 2020. And then in between the summer and Biden's inauguration, members Pato and Abdul Ali edited another zine called What Does an Uprising Doula Do? What is interesting in looking at how the zines, what is interesting is looking at how the zines were opportunities for doula members and other contributors to process what they were experiencing through participation and submission. At the same time, these publications act now as time capsules, holding the thoughts, feelings, and images of a specific moment in history through the lens of people informed by, impacted by, and living with HIV. With that in mind, I'm interested in how What Would an HIV Doula Do not only contributed to the many COVID and HIV compare and contrast conversations, we also made space to see how two pandemics ran parallel to each other, along with other public health crises such as mass incarceration, transphobia, anti-Black racism, loneliness, and more. Part 5. Pro tip: be careful who you accidentally become romantically involved with. Last October, after nearly a decade of easy breezy sex and then months of pandemic intimacy, I lost it when I found out my pod mate with benefits was dating someone he met at Reese. At some point, I called him a bit unhinged, and we agreed we had to stop. We had to stop having sex. And we did. We stopped having sex for a while. But eventually, we both started wanting to do it again with each other. So we met in Prospect Park an early spring 2021 evening to discuss how to make sex possible again. Eventually, we came up with a rule: fun only fucking. Joy was the goal. With that, we smiled, sought out some secluded forest. Ah, I said, admiring our semen glistening in this dirt. Nature is healing. Part 6. What Would an HIV Doula Do now has 50 members who are included in a regular email thread where we discuss everything from the new harm reduction zine we put out with visual aids and MoMA PS1 to our summer 2021 project, AIDS Is, AIDS Ain't 40 project, inspired again by Matthew. With this growth has come some adjustments. We are no longer a scrappy project. We are a rather large, informal group who deal with money, creative output, and most importantly, each other's feelings, time, and experiences. And we don't want to take any of that for granted. So with that in mind, we have changed structures once again. This summer, we will be trying out what it means to have regular meetings like we used to share, peer educate, and grow, while also having a structure that allows for people to break off and work on specific projects together. COVID, like HIV, is not over. And in the process of both pandemics continuing to unfold, people are suffering, and we are all changing, adapting, and learning how to be together differently, even if we don't know it as it's happening. There are no silver linings when it comes to mass death and suffering. Only opportunities for better ways forward that honor who we have lost, who we are now, and who we will be in the future. Thank you so much. I really look forward to the conversation we can have. Thank you.
It's a lot that was amazing. I feel that it kind of sat really well next to Matthew's thought. I want to actually ask Matthew to come back on as well, hey? And I have so many questions and comments and remarks, and I'm sure the audience does as well. But actually before that, I wanted to actually ask if either of you had questions for each other or comments or observations for each other with regard to your respective presentations. That might be a good place for us to start. If you don't, I have my own questions.
Well, maybe we should do a disclaimer and just say that I'll speak for me. I've known Matthew now for, I guess, 6 or 7 years. We are literally—
We've known each other for 9 years, for 10 years. Oh no, nine. We
We've
met
known each other for 37 years. We're clearly in love. And so just there's a lot of intimacy already between us. So I guess it's probably good to just name that. No, Matthew?
Yeah, no, totally. Ted and I love each other, and we share a lot with each other, and you won't be getting like a Rosie Elizabeth view split screen from us today. Maybe you will, who knows?
You know, I, I, I have a question, and this might be a kind of question to start our conversation, and it's a question that I asked at the first panel. I mean, first of all, there's a presumption that this series is about kind of compare and contrast between HIV and COVID-19, and I want to actually kind of push it is that, because it's not. This is actually a series about, as Esther put it out at the beginning, it's about sort of thinking about sex and sexuality and intimacy in this moment. And I kind of talked about that also in my opening remarks. However, there seems to be this impulse from the very beginning of this pandemic to kind of compare it with HIV/AIDS. And I was wondering, this is a question that I asked at the last panel as well, when we started the series in May. Why do I'm curious, why do you think this comparison happens? Why is it that HIV/AIDS and COVID-19 have been set against each other in this moment? And it doesn't quite make sense of that. So that's my question to start us off.
You know, I think that first, I just want to say that that is, to me, seems like a very human impulse. I think the earliest thing that we learn about the world is like, as a baby, is like, okay, let me put this in my mouth. How does this taste? And then I put thing B in my mouth and I'm like, does that taste good or bad? Or like, what is it? What's the mouth sensation? Like, that is how humans learn about things. Is like, okay, I picked this up and then I picked that up. Like, did this taste better? Did this feel better? Like, did this make me giggle? Did, like, you know, that is to me a very human response on some level. And I think that the AIDS epidemic is the closest thing that people have to understanding the COVID pandemic. And so it makes sense to me that people would compare and contrast them. But I think ultimately I'm less interested in comparing and contrasting them because I don't see them as separate. Like, I don't think that, I mean, obviously the AIDS epidemic has existed without the COVID pandemic, but the COVID pandemic has never existed without the AIDS epidemic. And so I don't know if there's a way to talk about the COVID pandemic that does not include the AIDS epidemic. So I don't see them as wholly separate. So I don't have the urge to compare and contrast them, because I think that they are concurrent as of, you know, as of the time when COVID-19 was living inside people before it was detected by people, they were concurrent viruses.
Yeah, I loved that you asked that question, Ricky, and I want to echo something that I think Ryan Conrad said. Like, it's important for us to consider who's doing the comparing, because not everyone, like most people actually aren't comparing the two. Most people, as Ryan said, most people aren't thinking about HIV/AIDS. So I think for me, the question is like, who is doing the comparison and why are we doing the comparison? And I think Matthew's reasons allude to a lot of that. And I know for me, especially in February and March of 2020, the people who I saw doing the most comparing were the people who were still the most traumatized by HIV, either because they were quote unquote there at the beginning of HIV in New York, or because of their own still ongoing unresolved questions and fears around HIV. And then, so that's one way to answer it. The other way I would answer it too is I'm interested in the other health pandemics that we don't talk about. Like, why don't we talk about Zika? Why don't we talk about SARS? Why don't we talk about MRSA or H1N1? Is that because of white supremacy, right? Is it because those pandemics happened quote unquote elsewhere? Or is it also because the response to those pandemics was relatively, quote unquote, better than the response to COVID or HIV? So those are some of my offerings for that first question.
And then also, what are the, I mean, so can I say, what are the things that we don't talk about when we talk about health pandemics that aren't viruses? Like, why don't we talk about prison as a health epidemic? Why don't we talk about policing as a health epidemic? Why don't we talk about things that actually affect people's health as epidemics? We can only talk about epidemics when it comes to like bacteria and viruses, but we should also be having conversations about societal phenomena that negatively impact health as health epidemics as well.
I think the point about policing as an epidemic is actually like quite important to think about, especially both historically and in the context of the present, right? And I think that what you the point I'm happy that you made this point about who's doing the comparison. Because you're right, a lot of people are not into like HIV/AIDS. Then they think about COVID-19. They're thinking about COVID-19 and not necessarily aware of the long history of HIV/AIDS. But it's really an interesting kind of moment to kind of think about precisely this very human response that I think Matthew made a remark about around how it is kind of an instinct. It's somewhat, for some people, it kind of fall into this space of comparing and contrasting what one experienced in the past and thinking about how it plays out in the present. And so, yeah, I wanted to start with that. Another question that I had, and you both kind of touched upon this in your own sort of way, in your respective thoughts. And that's a question that I had about personal responsibility, which is something that Matthew brought up in his presentation, and that you kind of enacted that conversation about personal responsibility with the vignettes that you talked about sort of this encounter with this lover and sort of how you navigated and negotiated that encounter. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about, either of you or both of you could talk a bit more about personal responsibility and what that means, especially in the context of stuff like policing and white supremacy. Because personal responsibility is an interesting way to think about the kinds of choices that we make as individuals, but how do we think about the collective in that context? I don't know if that makes sense, but you know.
Matthew, you and I should have buzzers. I mean, this is a really hard question for me to respond to, because I think one of the reasons that I enjoy and am drawn to being part of a collective is that I'm actually really interested and invested in thinking about collective choices. And I'm not saying that to suggest that I don't have personal impact. I'm not trying to get away from my rights and responsibilities as a white cis gay male who can be considered able-bodied in many ways. I'm not trying to avoid that conversation. I'm just saying that for me, most of my life has been thinking about collectivity. And that is because from a young age, I was thinking about HIV, and HIV was of interest to me because it taught me the kind of adult I wanted to be, but it also taught me about the kinds of worlds I wanted to be in. So there's that point. The other point I would say about personal responsibility is that the one thing that that I am thinking about a lot lately is around the vaccine and masking. And I am fully vaccinated. In order to come back to Canada, I've now had three negative COVID tests within 9 days. I'm having to quarantine for 14 days. And yet when I go, I'm still trying to be good. I'm trying to wear my mask. And I realize like so much of what I do in terms of personal responsibility is because I love and care for other people. And that part of my relationship with other people is I hope they will do that in return. I don't have much interesting to say, but that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I would just kind of echo that. Like, I feel like a lot of what we talk about when we talk about personal responsibility is actually communal responsibility, and that like personal responsibility is a buzzword or a term that gets used to often solely to punish, but like, what about, I think what Ted is saying and what I believe is that like, you know, if you flip it and turn it to a positive, like our responsibility is to each other. But even then, you know, there's so many intricacies, you know, and in what ways do we have to be responsible to each other? What does that always look like? What happens when we fall short? Like, I don't know. It's a very thorny question for me.
Can I jump back in?
Yeah.
This is also bringing up drug use for me and harm reduction for me. And I'm a really big fan of any of those memes online that show us like that wait, let me start again. There's a wonderful meme that shows you some of the characters in The Devil Wears Prada. And it shows like, you think the villain is Miranda, but actually the villain is the boyfriend. And when I think about personal responsibility, I'm tired of saying that the villain is the person who's doing drugs and not the person who is, you know, cutting housing budgets. That is if we're going to talk about personal responsibilities, I'd rather talk about the personal responsibilities of politicians who lie or who cheat, or talk about the billionaires who are trying to get to space because the planet is heating up. You know what I mean? Like, those are conversations are a little bit, that's where I'd go.
Yeah, it's the same thing, I think, when we talk about personal responsibility and sex and, you know, like, and stuff like that. Like, where is the responsibility of you know, people to make harm reduction available? Where is the responsibility of people to make you know, biopreventive medication or treatment available? I mean, there's usually a macro answer, and people think of personal responsibility as micro, but there's people who are signing, you know, legislation or enacting policies that are ultimately their personal responsibility that do much more harm or good.
I want to actually open it up to the audience now, and then we'll come back to kind of having a conversation back and forth, but I want Sally to see some comments and questions from the audience, if there are any. I think there are some. I can see some.
Yeah. So we had a question right at the beginning during Matthew's talk from Jennifer. I said, thank you, Matthew, for this framing. Can you talk about how you see history as a response to nostalgia?
Ooh, I think that question's too smart for me. I don't even. History as a response to nostalgia. Well, so for me, like I will say this, almost everything I know about AIDS and the response to AIDS, it comes from conversations with people who lived through and are thinking about AIDS. And obviously that means people who are living now, because we are still living with AIDS, but it's come through conversations with people, and not solely digesting all my information about AIDS from a purely capitalist framework. So like movies and books are capitalist frameworks, like they exist to make someone money. So I'm talking about like a framework where I've learned a lot of my history through the availability to me of a community that is interested in thinking about AIDS and having those conversations. So for me, that history, you know, it's funny, when I was talking about thinking of AIDS as a cabinet curio, another word that I think, yes, not all movies exist to make money, I apologize, sorry. A lot of them do, I think what I'm talking is mainstream media narratives, I apologize. Now where was I? Because I have, sorry, I felt the need to respond to that, and then I lost my place. But so speaking with people who are thinking about AIDS has been a boon to me, and yeah, I kind of lost it. I'll come back to it. I'm sorry. I apologize to the person who asked that question. Oh, that's right, cabinet curios. Okay, sorry. So, when I was talking about it, I also thought about the idea of like an heirloom, because I always think of an heirloom as like something that has a history to it, and it's like, you know, a family heirloom, and it has a history to it, but you think of it as in the past and it has a lot of value, but you don't touch it, or like you inherit it, but you don't think about it. And my understanding of AIDS has been that it is not an heirloom. And I'm a queer person, I'm a queer Latino person, I'm a person whose father died from an AIDS-related illness in the year 2011. It was recent, it was not, you know, in the 80s or 90s. So I, you know, don't think of AIDS as something that my ancestors or my forefathers or my whatever solved and is there for me to not engage with. Like, I think that thinking of the history as ongoing, and that having these important conversations with people who are thinking actively about the ongoingness of history itself as well is very important to my understanding of AIDS as not being over there.
Okay, well, we have another question that I'm actually going to combine with a question that I have, if that's okay. So Allison asked, Ted, can you please explain the GIF in your last slide? Don't let anyone tell you that AIDS is 40. And I actually have a question about that around like timelines and barriers to pandemics, and what these pandemics mean to people, particularly queer people who live in like non-normative timelines. So in reference to like, don't let anyone tell you that AIDS is 40, I'm interested in how we mark the timelines of these pandemics. And as you mentioned, Matthew, you want to challenge the ideas of the timelines for COVID-19, like when it started. And like, I guess I'm interested in our desire to like mark the beginnings and ends of these pandemics, and how that like both serves to like return a queer community to like a mainstream, and also like return people from COVID-19 to this sense of business as usual.
So I'll answer this in two ways, if that's okay. The first way I'll answer it is that, as Ricky said in my introduction, Alexandra Uaz and I have written a book for Duke University Press called We're Having This Conversation Now, a cultural timeline of HIV/AIDS, in which we look at the quote unquote history of AIDS in different epochs. We start with AIDS before AIDS. So pre-1981, we know that HIV was circulating, people were living with. And then there's the first silence, which is 1981 to 1987. And that's when, you know, people are aware of HIV, but there's still a lot of silence and connections aren't being made. And then there's the AIDS crisis culture, and that is 87 to 96, and that basically like begins with stuff like ACT UP and kind of starts to slow down with the release of medication in 1996. And then we have the period that I call the second silence, which is 1996 to 2008. And that's the period closest to my heart. That's the period I grew up, I came of age in. And that's when, you know, HIV is still a thing. People are still being diagnosed. People are still dying, but it's not taking up as much space in media. And so connections aren't being made. And then that's followed by AIDS crisis revisitation. And Matthew really spoke beautifully about that and the way it kind of braids with nostalgia. And some of it's helpful and some of it's really not helpful, as Matthew made clear for us. And that's like 2008-ish to ongoing. We still see some AIDS crisis nostalgia. And then Alex and I are working on this last phase, which we think we're in right now too, called AIDS normalization and AIDS crisis. And the word crisis is kind of in brackets because for many people, AIDS is still a crisis, but that's not being seen by other people. And because of many factors, AIDS is being normalized in everyday conversation. So it's not being silenced, but it's also not at the crisis level. So that means when you watch a show like Pose, it is both interesting and not interesting that HIV is in it. It should be in it. And COVID is speeding up the normalization of HIV AIDS because COVID is putting HIV in history. It's putting it in a list. So that's one way to answer that timeline question. And Tali, to your point, that's a very quote unquote normative timeline. And you can reject it if you want, because the thing that we're doing with AIDS ain't 40 is this idea that AIDS begins for you when it begins. So if you are diagnosed today, and that is the first time that you've actually heard about HIV, which is possible. We know many cases of people who don't really understand or know about HIV until they're diagnosed, then the timeline starts for you today. And it doesn't matter if Robert Rayford was living with HIV in 1968. It matters what your life is with right now. So my own practice is both very interested in how AIDS timelines are constructed and how we internalize them and how we can work with and against them, but also how we can, you know, I've already sworn today, so how we can fuck with them. And I think the more we fuck with them, the more we loosen AIDS from a calcified idea and the more we actually, you know, eradicate the harm of the virus in people's lives.
Yeah, and I just want to jump on and talk about AIDS as AIDS ain't 40 and kind of like, not that there is a timeline itself for AIDS as AIDS ain't 40, but let's talk about kind of the genesis of it. But, you know, so I'm a member, as Ted had mentioned several times, I'm a member of the doulas, and I had received an email from a fellow journalist, and they had asked, oh, the 40th anniversary of the AIDS epidemic proper is coming up, what are some things that we want to talk about or bring up or whatever. And it really just hit me the wrong way, because when I heard the 40th anniversary, what a lot of people are talking about, and there are several dates throughout the summer, is probably that they're talking about one of two things. Like, I would bet my bottom dollar that they're talking about one of two things, which are either the CDC writing the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report that first identified 5 gay men living with, getting pneumocystis pneumonia, or they're talking about the July 3rd rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals, New York Times piece. Both of those things happened 40 years ago in 1981, and they were both watershed moments for a cultural understanding of AIDS, even though obviously, as Ted just said, what came after was a silence, but it was because it was like those were big things, but then, so many structures around that happening refused to talk about AIDS, including the government, or refused to do anything. But I don't like those timelines, because what happens when you say, this is the 40th anniversary of AIDS, and you link it to a group of doctors in Atlanta, where the CDC is in America, like a group of doctors finally discovered the virus and discovered, in quotes, the virus, and then wrote about it and disseminated that information. So, okay, that makes the anniversary an anniversary of recognition by the state, not an anniversary of when HIV first started circulating in humans, in human bloodstreams, not an anniversary of, you know, when the first time someone leaned into someone's ear and was like, hey, have you heard about this thing that's happening? You know, there are so many points before that that are valid places to, I think the idea too is that there is no one anniversary, right? Like we want to destabilize that idea. But to say that the anniversary is 1981 is to say like, okay, you're either saying that the anniversary is contingent on a group of doctors in Atlanta or the paper of record in New York. Like that's what you're hinging anniversary on, not the actual anniversary of HIV existing among humans. So exactly, as Stuart's saying too, like they're regionally and racially specific. So like, actually in Sarah Schulman's new book, Let the Record Show, she talks about like, you know, the people who were in the CDC report, right? They were gay white men. And actually the person that, you know, there were people who were Black who were living with pneumocystis pneumonia at the time. They were actually not included in the report first. And also, so their status as gay white men made them marginalized enough that they would, you know, die of an AIDS-related condition, but they were privileged enough to have access to doctors that could get to the CDC to get them to recognize it. But for those 5 white gay men, there were people before them who were people of color, who were drug users, who did not have access to the type of care where word would get to the CDC, right? So we're talking about people who both benefited from and were victims of a white supremacy, a white supremacist system.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I was thinking about the question of temporality, and it's this idea that, and this is sort of building on what Ali was saying, you know, clear time is not straight time, right? It's not a linear time. Clear time is always kind of a sense of it. It has a sense of history, but it also has a sense of the future, and it's always a relationship that is constantly in flux in the past, in the present, in the future, and it can't really mark, you know, is clear on the anniversaries necessarily. I mean, people lie, but I don't think it's actually entirely possible. And you know, I mean, in my, you know, we all came into this world around HIV/AIDS for very different and very personal reasons, right? I mean, Matthew talked about your father, Matthew talked about growing up in a particular period. In my own relationship with HIV/AIDS as an HIV negative person comes from a family member who passed away like, in the mid-70s, who may or may not have died of HIV, but the family law or the family idea is that he might have passed away from HIV. But and so my own relationship with it comes from a place of that a story that was kind of passed down to me. And that story doesn't necessarily have an temporality or a fixed starting point, but it has informed so much of how I understand myself as a queer man. And so I think there's something about this kind of temporality when you think about it that doesn't always make sense if you really only think about it in a linear sense. But so I just kind of wanted to add that.
And thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question from the Q&A. So Andrew Zuli asks, can either Ted or Matthew address the issue of bathhouses, sex, and COVID?
Matthew, do you want to start? Because you want to talk about your amazing article, which has inspired so many of us.
The casual sex one. Which article, Ted? Which inspiring article are you talking about? Yeah, you know, I wrote an article and it was in a different time. I mean, we've all been through, there's been so many COVIDs that we've lived through, first of all. We've all lived through so many COVIDs. And I wrote an article that came out, I want to say May of last year, or May or June of last year, that was about the need for us to have a plan for how to have casual sex under COVID. And that the basis of that article was that when you present someone with, you know, your only choice is to stay inside and not see anyone, or go outside and, you know, risk everything and wear a mask, and there's no in between and there's no nuance, like, you know, you actually don't give people the chance to live and thrive. And I will say, when I wrote this article, a lot of people responded, well, like, well, you shouldn't be thriving under COVID. Like, that was actually a big response that I got, was like, it's not your time to thrive. And I do understand that we all had to make sacrifices, but I think what I was looking for when I wrote it was, I was asking the question of, like, is there a way to incorporate our knowledge of harm reduction into finding sexual pleasure during the lockdown times? And, you know, my answer kept coming back to, I spoke to this one researcher, Julia Marcus at Harvard, who spoke about harm reduction in that context. And she said something really smart and beautiful, which is that everyone should have access to harm reduction tools, no matter what type of sex they want to have, right? So what we should be thinking about is almost like a spectrum that goes from, if you want to, if what you want out of your sexual life during COVID is something that's low risk or no risk, and you are comfortable, and that's the only thing you're comfortable with, then what we have for you is like masturbation, right? Like, and it has to do with what you want and what you're comfortable with. This is all not personal responsibility, personal, like pleasure feeling. And on the other side, you know, if you do want to attend a sex party, like, how do we get proper ventilation? How do we get air moving in those spaces? How do we get, you know, are there ways to incorporate sex into a bathhouse or a group sex situation that is lower risk? That's why the New York City Department of Health in the beginning emphasized like glory hole usage, right? Because if you want to have a sex party, you can set up a bunch of glory holes to put a barrier between, you know, someone's droplets and your mouth. Yeah, so I'm interested in that spectrum. Basically, the idea is, no matter what type of sex you want to have, there should be a way for you to reduce the harm as much as possible. So, you know, that includes everything from masturbation to sex party. When you don't give people those options, and when there is not information on how to reduce harm, that is when people get sick, because you haven't presented people with information on how to have the type of sex that they see for themselves, and how to realize that in the safest way possible. Stuart's adding, and I think this is really interesting. So I'm actually, as Ricky said, there is I'm now a senior editor at The Atlantic, and I'm actually, you know, spoiler, I'm actually doing a story, or I'm editing a story right now that's about like some of the lessons that queer people have learned from keeping the fire of their sexuality alive during the pandemic, and then switching over now, because I think so many people are in the United States, of course, I am in a US context, and I openly speak that, are kind of dipping their toe into like, okay, well, what does it mean to be on the apps again? What does it mean to maybe go? I was invited to like a sex party like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, I don't think I'm ready for that personally. Like, that's where I was like, not me, not now, but like, there are people who are opening themselves back up. And it's funny because I'm thinking a lot about the ways that queer people, especially queer people who are on apps or on hookup apps, and I include Tinder as a hookup app, but like queer people who are on apps and who are navigating that already have such a language around navigating health and sexuality. Like, we already have this language of like, how do we keep each other, how do we like fuck hardcore, but also keep each other safe? And now it's like a lot of people have that language and are bringing it over to COVID. Like, we can have conversations about like, is your roommate okay with me coming over? Is your, you know, how do you want to do this? There's so many ways that I think that a lot of queer people have those tools already because of, frankly, like fear and the internalization of a world with AIDS. So I'm interested really in how queer people are having those conversations as some American people go into a reentry phase. Obviously that, like, when I talk about that, I'm talking about like a very small part of the world population, and I have to like speak that. But I ultimately, I think that we need to give people tools to have whatever type of sex they desire for themselves, and tap into the kind of queer harm reduction parlance that we have adopted for ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah. That-
I was just gonna say, yeah, I want to name that I'm a cis gay male dude. And so my experience is, or even what I'm gonna say is very specific and very limited. I also want to say something about being part of what would an HIV doula do that's been helpful in thinking about sex is like, you know, when we get together like this and we are using words queer and sex and bathhouse, some people might think we're only talking about certain types of folks, but I know that actually there is a lot of like, you know, monogamous people who COVID has changed their sex life. Like, what did it mean to be quarantining 24/7 with someone who is your primary partner, maybe your co-parent, maybe now your coworker, who is also your primary sex partner, right? And so thinking about like, how is COVID changing sex lives up and down and across the board and stuff like that. And I want to say, so what would an HIV doula do has been an important place for me to collectively think about other people's sex lives. And then to get back to Andrew's really beautiful question, like the collective, bathhouses were an important place for me to learn about other people's sex lives too. And it was at the bathhouse where I learned that part of my sexual identity was sharing pleasure with other people. And actually, like, being a matchmaker in a bathhouse is one of my favorite things in the world to do. But then I moved to New York, and bathhouse culture, because of Giuliani and because of negative responses to HIV/AIDS, bathhouse culture in New York pretty much doesn't exist. And what sprang out of bathhouse culture were kind of privatized parties, or parties that were invite only, or you had to basically audition for them. And I'm on a bunch of those mailing lists, especially when I first came. And a lot of those parties were born out of trauma around HIV. One of them, you have to take a vow that you will not have unprotected sex. You go through an interview and then you make a vow that you won't have unprotected sex at the party. And what's really interesting for me is that party, that exact party, was the first party to come back after COVID-19, like in this vaccine phase. And I'm still trying to think about that. And of course, at the party, lots of people were having condomless anal sex. And so I'm curious about, like, we are often put in a position where we lie about safer sex. And so I assume we're also going to be in positions where we're going to lie, and people are going to lie about vaccines and stuff like that. So
Right.
I don't have a cohesive thought. I just wanted to throw that out there.
You know, I'm generally not a hopeful person, but I am. What I find hopeful, and this is the case of HIV/AIDS, and it's the case of COVID. I'm amazed at the creativity and the innovation that goes in about sex and sexuality. You know, as a psychotherapist, I'm often talking to patients and clients of mine who are talking to me about their sex lives, and I'm fascinated and impressed that the a language that's out there, and the ways in which people really think about creative and innovative ways to have sex and intimacy. And that there is a way in which people really push their thinking process. I think the point that Matthew made about having access to language, that if you go on an app, people have access to language. It's just that there is discourse around what sex looks like or what kind of sex people are looking for. And I think that comes out of a response to historical trauma around how people navigate um, viruses and contagions and disease and illness and stuff like that. I think there is an opportunity for creativity and innovation to come out with this. And I'm really interested to kind of think about that as time passes as well. So,
I think also it would be interesting for us, considering who's hosting us, is to think more intersectionally about like disability studies, communities living with disabilities, gay people, queer people, like the experiences of being a queer person living with disability is navigating sex in and outside of the pandemic with other opportunities and barriers, right? So I think, I mean, I would love to hear more about that.
I mean, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all disabled people, but one of the first things that kind of came up in conversation amongst my colleagues and I was how living with a disability or living with a chronic illness or some or has always already prepared us for the pandemic in some ways because life is quite restricted for many of us. So depending on how we think about disability and what disabilities people have. And so, there's a lot that I think communities, disabled communities in offer with respect to education, knowledge around what it means about this moment of confinement, of isolation, of alienation, and separation from others. And I think the conversations are kind of ongoing when you kind of really think about how people are navigating movement or a lack of movement or restricted movement. So yeah, I mean, it's not so much a comment as much as thinking out loud around what it means to navigate spaces in this particular context. Ellie, I think do we have more questions?
We have another question in the Q&A also from Mr. Zealy, asking Matthew why you distinguish COVID as a pandemic and AIDS as an epidemic.
I saw that question, and honestly, that's if I'm open to being challenged. I hold no allegiance to those terms. Those are ways in which I understand the ongoing, both ongoing crises. Those are not terms to which I am wedded, nor do I believe in marriage. So I would not be wedded to those terms. So I would love to hear why those terms should be challenged in the chat, or I don't know how it's, or whatever. However, angry emails, no, kind emails.
I mean, for me, it also just speaks to the slipperiness of language, to go back to language. Like, I'm not always clear about what the differences are. So
Yeah.
same with HIV and AIDS, right? Like I'm often,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Oh my God, the difference between HIV and AIDS, that's like, I mean, I mean, and there's, I mean, you know, one of the things that's important to recognize is how wedded people are, and I hate that I used that word, how much meaning the term AIDS has for some people, right? Like, especially for an older generation, like there are so many people who find actually a lot of their own type of comfort in that word because of like the community they built around AIDS. And when I had that slide that talked about AIDS is all those things, it's because, you know, I find that AIDS has sometimes an emotional component to it that a term, and I'm not saying that there's no one that doesn't have an emotional connection to the terms HIV either, but sometimes in its acronymness and its clinicalness, but like AIDS often feels like a very emotionally loaded term. You know? And that doesn't mean for everyone, that's something that I've observed for a lot of people. As Whitney Houston would say in that clip, sometimes. That means sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, and language is so significant, right? How we navigate and how we think about kind of emotional balances at different turns of place and what it means with different communities and different generations, and how language is also constantly evolving as time passes, right? Ben?
I would also say how stories evolve or don't evolve over time. I think that's really interesting. Stuart made a point earlier in the comments, and Matthew wisely, pulled it out, thinking about like what are the other aspects that make people think that epidemics or pandemics are over. And there's an amazing British scholar named Gabriel Griffith. And in the early 2000s, she wrote a book looking at Derek Jarman's Blue and looking at like kind of like the lack of conversation being had about HIV in the early 2000s. And she was asking the question that many of us, myself included, thinking about the second silence, like quote unquote, why did we stop talking about HIV, or why did AIDS stop taking up so much space in the public commons? And of course, we can name things like white supremacy, gay exceptionalism, the introduction of medication. And Gabrielle Griffith has such an elegant response. She said also, the media, AIDS became too complicated after 1996, and the media didn't know how to cover it, because the easiest story in the world to tell is a story that has an arc that ends in death. That is the quintessential news story. And after 96, HIV didn't just only mean death. It meant life for some, complicated suffering for others, death for some people due to complex reasons. And so I think it's really interesting. We are in the 1996 moment of COVID right now, where we see a lot of people no longer, quote unquote, suffering from COVID, no longer dying from COVID because of geographic privilege, because of white supremacy, because of all of these things. But we know, and Matthew said this in his presentation, we know that the people who are going to be quote unquote stuck with the COVID ongoing pandemic are the people who are already underserved by healthcare in Canada, by healthcare in the United States, and healthcare globally.
Can I ask you almost like what I feel is a tangential question that I'm interested in, though, is like, I love that you said, or that you kind of paraphrased Gabrielle Griffith and saying, basically, the way I'll interpret it, this is my interpretation of you interpreting Gabrielle Griffith, is that once AIDS got less sexy, the media didn't talk about it, and it was too hard and too complicated. I'm interested in that second silence and the way it overlapped with something like PEPFAR. Do you talk about that when you write about it? Like how AIDS also, once there were medications available at home and, you know, the story got complicated, and how then PEPFAR made it like an international story. Like, is there any correlation when you write about it to PEPFAR or no?
I mean, I think I would say no, because I think I would be worried about that being ahistorical, because I think for a lot of people, HIV was global much earlier than PEPFAR. So
Yeah.
we don't, Alex and I don't make that correlation. I would say that the media did make that correlation. That's where you get all that kind of really gross stuff about the new face of AIDS. So it went from being like thin white gay men in North American hospitals to, you know, mothers and grandmothers living in different countries in Africa. And so I try to be careful about that, but I think that there is, some people have that. I would also say there's one other book I want to mention. I can't remember the title, but it's by Dion Kagan out of Australia. And he writes some of the things, he's answering some of the questions that you might be interested in. He's thinking about, he uses media, including My Best Friend's Wedding. No, not My Best Friend's Wedding. What's the movie with Madonna and Rupert Everett?
The Next Best Thing.
The Next Best Thing. He uses The Next Best Thing. He sees that almost as a second silence film. And he looks at how when HIV stopped impacting gay white men, the AIDS narrative changed. And so then to fill in the vacuum were things like PEPFAR and stuff like that.
Can I just say that I also always mix up My Best Friend's Wedding and The Next Best Thing. And I didn't realize other people besides me did it until this moment. I thought it was like a me phenomenon.
No, we have a few minutes left, and I kind of, well, I want to ask if you had any final remarks, but maybe I can also ask one last question. You know, going back to this idea of temporality and then COVID and HIV, you know, there's so much discourse that's going on around kind of post-AIDS or a return to normal, whatever that means for different people. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, about post-AIDS. Oh, and post-COVID, sorry, post-AIDS. I was just saying that actually. There is no post anything, but I'm curious about if you have any thoughts about this idea around post-COVID, and what we might be able to do in order to kind of critique it to some extent. I mean, everyone wants to be back to normal. And I don't want to critique people's desire for wanting things to return to normal, but returning to normal is such a, for some of us, it's such something we don't actually want.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the normal was not ever normal for us, you know? So I'm curious about if you had any thoughts about that or any final thoughts.
It's an interesting question because two things. I find myself sometimes using that term, and then when I say it, I'm like, well, no, it's not that. But like, it's a shorthand that when I use, people know what I'm talking about. But at the same time, I'm like, but I don't want to use that, nor do I want to normalize it. Like, no. Because I do think that the arm of COVID is long. You know, like the ways in which it has challenged our ideas of intimacy, justice. I mean, obviously, so much happened to our notions of justice and injustice during lockdown. So intimacy, justice, connection, what does it mean to hug someone? Like, there's so many things that COVID has challenged in our lives, and I don't know that those will ever go away for some. Like, I'm really interested, honestly, in like the people who lived through COVID when, I mean, like, I have a niece and a nephew who are 9 or 10. And I'm like so interested in like what it means when their generation becomes like, 21. And I remember being 21 and like, I'm a millennial and it was like everyone was making fun of us, right? Because like I'm interested in like what happens when that generation grows up having lived under quarantine for a significant amount of time in their development. So I don't think that COVID we're ever going to be post-COVID, especially for younger people. Like I'm not, and I'm not saying it's going to go away for older people either, but I think that we're going to be seeing the ramifications of COVID for such a long time that we can't even envision that far in the future yet. And I think also it almost just goes back, because you were talking about final thoughts as well. Like, I also think talking of post-COVID itself is almost, it's almost like nostalgia, but it's like Dua Lipa's album Future Nostalgia.
Yeah.
It's like, I am nostalgic, but I'm nostalgic for something that's coming. So it's a very, it is a fetishization of the past, right? Because we're saying like, oh, the past was so great, but so much that we learned about COVID was that, so many of our systems were messed up. So many of, so many of the things that we thought the world was founded on are shitty and crumbling. And so I don't think that will ever be post-COVID. And I think that, and that's it. And Dua Lipa.
For me, I mean, my life's work is around HIV/AIDS, and often I will meet people for the first time and they will feel like they will have feelings that they don't know about HIV or they don't care about HIV. And especially if they want us to be friends or they are trying to be nice to me. And what I'll say to them is, I don't care if you are not individually aware that you're impacted by HIV, that's okay. But if you care about the core things that exacerbate the harm of HIV, like transphobia, like racism, like xenophobia, like poverty, then that is more than enough for me. And I would say the same about COVID too. It's okay in 2 years, if you don't think about COVID, if you don't write the word COVID, if you don't click on a headline because you actually are a little bit triggered or traumatized by COVID, that's a-okay. But what I would hope you would keep, and this is kind of echoing some of the things that Matthew said, is like, what are the things you learned about justice? What are the things that you learned about the world that you want during this period that you're going to bring forward with you? And as long as you stay true to your ethics and justice and a better world for all of us, I mean, you do you. And it's okay if you're post-COVID, as long as you're still working towards justice. That's how I feel.
Yeah. Questions of justice always involving, and I especially also like the point that you made about your niece and nephew. Like, I also have a nephew who is 5, and I keep, and I have, as an therapist, I work with kids for quite some time, and I keep thinking about how they will remember this moment, or what a memory of this moment is. This is such a unique period, and yet it's also not unique for many. And so, from a developmental perspective, I'm curious about the kind of memory that is going to be carried on 10, 15, 20 years down the line. So that point really resonated with me. And that brings us to the very end of this amazing panel. I want to take this opportunity to thank Matthew and Ed and my colleagues at the School of Disability Studies, and Esther, my director, to Gary, my research assistant, and Cindy and Emma for doing the ASL, and also to Angie for providing closed captioning. I also want to thank the audience for coming out on this afternoon from wherever you are locked on. And I also want to remind you that there are 4 more panels. There's a panel every month in October. So the next one is on Friday, July 16th at the same time. And it's going to be just as exciting, just as fun. I hope you can make it. And that's it. Bye, everyone.